During World War II, America's most protected secret wasn't a superweapon or an intelligence breakthrough. It was a single artillery round. Not a city-destroying bomb, not a complex cipher machine, not a new chemical agent or a grand invasion plan. It was just a shell. An ordnance piece no larger than a bottle of wine, containing something deep inside its nose that the known laws of physics declared should be instantly obliterated upon firing. For 2 full years, the U.S. Navy was so consumed with fear of this technology falling into enemy possession that warships received orders to jettison their ammunition into the sea rather than let one single shell be captured. Admirals were informed via written directive that the secret of this round was more important than the vessel carrying it and more valuable than the lives of its crew. That is no exaggeration. That was a direct command from the highest echelons of American military command. Yet today, hardly anyone is aware this shell ever existed. To grasp why the United States was prepared to sacrifice entire ships to safeguard one type of artillery, you must first comprehend the total nightmare that was anti-aircraft combat by 1941. A standard 5-inch naval gun launches a projectile at approximately 2,800 feet per second. This shell weighs around 54 pounds. It flies in a high arc, and somewhere along that trajectory, it must intercept an airplane flying at 300 miles per hour, an aircraft that is constantly changing its altitude, altering its course, and weaving through a chaotic sky filled with smoke and explosions. Before the war began, the raw mathematics of this challenge had been calculated, and the results were grim. To bring down a single enemy aircraft using conventional anti-aircraft ordnance, a warship would need to fire around 1,000 shells. 1,000, and every one of those rounds had to be individually prepared with a fuse. This could be a contact fuse, demanding a direct impact on a target moving faster than a bullet from a rifle, or a timed fuse. This required a gunner to guess exactly where that plane would be in 4 or 5 seconds and then set a mechanical timer to explode at that precise instant. If the timing was off by even a fraction of a second, which it almost always was, the shell would detonate uselessly in empty space. Think about the implications of that. A naval vessel carries a limited supply of ammunition. Every round that misses is a round you don't have for the subsequent assault. And in the Pacific Theater, where Japanese pilots were intentionally crashing their planes into American ships, the next attack could be mere seconds away. The Kamikaze pilots had no need to survive. Their only goal was to reach the ship's deck. Against an adversary willing to die, a 1 in 1,000 chance of stopping him was not a viable defense. Was a guaranteed death sentence. The concept of a shell that could think, a round that didn't require a direct hit but only needed to get close, had circulated in military discussions since the 1930s. The British had even tinkered with photoelectric fuses for their rockets, attempting to use light as a trigger for detonation. The principle was straightforward enough in theory. Place a sensor of some kind in the tip of a shell. When that sensor detects proximity to an object, a plane, another ship, the ground, it triggers the charge. No direct impact is necessary. No timer needs to be set. The shell itself would do all the work. But a single problem made every physicist who examined it simply shake his head in disbelief. An artillery shell is not a gentle place. The instant that round exits the barrel of a 5-inch gun, it is slammed with a setback force equal to 20,000 times the force of gravity. 20,000 Gs. For some perspective, a fighter pilot executing a tight maneuver endures about 9 Gs and risks passing out. An artillery shell endures over 2,000 times that amount of force in an instant, and simultaneously, the rifling inside the gun barrel sets the shell spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute. Any electronic part within that shell, every vacuum tube, every wire, every single glass component, had to withstand that incredible acceleration and spin without shattering, disconnecting, or otherwise failing. Then, after surviving the most violent launch imaginable, these components had to awaken, power themselves on, begin broadcasting a radio signal, receive the echo of that signal, analyze if that echo indicates a target, and then trigger a detonator. All this had to happen within seconds, inside a metal housing the size of a coffee thermos. In 1940, the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance assessed this problem and came to the only logical conclusion an engineer could. It was impossible. This is where Merle Tuve joins the narrative. And to appreciate the kind of intellect that would embrace a challenge the entire US military had written off as pure fantasy, we have to travel back to a small town on the South Dakota plains at the turn of the WWII 20th century. Merle Anthony Tuve was born on June 27, 1901 in Canton, South Dakota. His father was the president of a college. His mother was a music teacher. All four of his grandparents had emigrated from Norway. Canton was a community of roughly 2,000 people surrounded by vast farmland, a place where everyone knew their neighbors. Living just across the street from Merle was another boy, born just 6 weeks after him, a tall, lanky, and curious kid named Ernest Lawrence. The two became inseparable. By age 13, Merle and Ernest were constructing their own wireless radio sets in Merle's attic, soldering coils, tuning circuits, and stringing antennas between their homes. They built a shortwave transmitter so powerful it could contact stations all across the Midwest. They built gliders and launched them from barn roofs. By any measure, they were two of America's most scientifically gifted teenagers, growing up opposite each other in a town most people couldn't find on a map. Their lives diverged after high school. Lawrence would go on to invent the cyclotron, the first truly practical particle accelerator, and earn a Nobel Prize in physics. During the war, he would be instrumental in creating the atomic bomb. Tuve chose a different route. After his father succumbed to the 1918 influenza pandemic, his family relocated to Minneapolis. Tuve got his degree from the University of Minnesota, followed by a doctorate from Johns Hopkins. In 1925, he did something that would shape the rest of his career. And though no one could have known it then, it would also shape the outcome of the war. Working alongside physicist Gregory Bright, Tuve used pulsed radio waves to calculate the altitude of the ionosphere. He transmitted a radio signal directly upward into the atmosphere and timed how long it took for the echo to return. That single experiment, sending a signal out and listening for its reflection, was the theoretical basis for radar, and it was the very same principle that would later enable the proximity fuse to function. Merle Tuve had been preparing for this since he was a teenager. He just didn't know what he was preparing for. By 1940, Tuve was at the Carnegie Institution of Washington's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism. He was a well-respected physicist, but far from a famous one. He'd never designed a weapon. He had no military contracting experience. But Vannevar Bush, the man FDR had placed in charge of America's entire military science effort, was familiar with Tuve's work on radio wave reflection. And Bush believed that if anyone could figure out how to cram a functional radio station inside a spinning artillery shell, it was the man who had built a career bouncing radio waves off of things and listening for the return. In August of 1940, Bush assigned Tuve as the chairman of Section T of the National Defense Research Committee. The name was intentionally unremarkable. Section T. It sounded like a logistics department. It was, in reality, the most aggressive miniaturization effort in the history of electronics. Tuve began recruiting physicists, engineers, and radio specialists. His team started at the Carnegie Institution, but soon outgrew the space, relocating to a massive new complex that would become the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. At its height, over 1,000 scientists and engineers operated under Tuve's command. and Tuve pushed them with a ferocity that became the stuff of legend. He was notoriously short-tempered, brutally honest, and completely unconcerned with the feelings of military officers. When a Navy captain toured the lab and speculated the project might take 5 years, Tuve allegedly retorted that in 5 years, there might not be a Navy left to use it. He plastered signs on the laboratory walls. One read, "I do not want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another stated, "Shoot at an 80% job. We cannot afford perfection." A third declared, "The best job in the world is a total failure if it is too late. Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit. Its failure there is our failure." This was not just a corporate slogan. This was a physicist who deeply understood that every month his team spent solving one of these problems was another month of sinking ships and dying sailors. The technical hurdles were immense. Consider the vacuum tubes. In 1940, a typical vacuum tube was a delicate glass bulb the size of your fist, seated in a ceramic base with fragile wire pins. Launch one from a gun, and it would disintegrate into powder before the shell even cleared. The barrel. Tuve's team, working with the physicist James Van Allen, the same Van Allen who would later discover the radiation belts encircling Earth, created an entirely new type of vacuum tube. It was miniaturized, cast in solid glass instead of being an evacuated bulb, and had wire leads embedded directly in the glass, replacing the delicate socket pins. These new tubes were tiny, smaller than a person's thumb, and they were engineered to withstand forces that could pulverize a building. 5 of these tubes were needed for every single fuse. Then came the issue of a power source. The fuse required electricity to operate its radio, but you cannot place a live battery inside a shell that might sit in storage for years. The solution was brilliant in its concept, but a nightmare to actually produce. The team engineered a wet cell battery, where the electrolyte, the liquid that activates the battery, was sealed inside a tiny glass ampule at the battery's core. When the shell was fired and started spinning, centrifugal force would shove the liquid outward, shattering the ampule and instantly flooding the battery cells. In under 2 seconds, the battery would go from being completely inert to fully powered. It was like designing a car engine that assembles itself while the vehicle is already moving at 200 miles per hour. The radio itself was a miniature oscillator and receiver. It broadcast a continuous radio wave from the shell's nose. As the shell flew, that signal spread out in all directions. If the signal encountered nothing, it just faded away. But if the shell came near something solid, an aircraft wing, a fuselage, even a large bird, the signal would bounce back. And here is the true genius. The shell is moving forward. The target is also moving. The reflected signal returns at a slightly altered frequency compared to the transmitted one, a phenomenon known as the Doppler effect. It's the same principle that makes an ambulance siren sound higher-pitched as it approaches you and lower as it moves away. The Fuze's receiver was built to detect this frequency shift. When that shift hit a certain threshold, indicating the shell was close enough to its target, about 70 feet, the circuit would close and the shell would explode. No direct hit was ever needed. The sky itself became a weapon. But the most elegant part of the design was its safety system. You can't have a shell exploding 10 feet from your own ship. The Fuze incorporated several safety features. It wouldn't arm itself until the shell had completed a minimum number of rotations, which guaranteed it had traveled a safe distance from the gun. It was designed not to respond to its own muzzle blast, and it had a self-destruct timer that would detonate the round after a predetermined flight time even if it missed, preventing live ordnance from falling into the ocean or, much worse, onto friendly positions intact. 130 miniaturized parts, 5 tiny vacuum tubes, a self-building battery, and a radio station that could survive 20,000 Gs all crammed into a metal cylinder small enough to screw onto the tip of a standard 5-inch shell. And for the first year and a half, it was a complete failure. Early prototypes detonated inside the gun barrel. Others armed too soon and exploded moments after leaving the muzzle, close enough to kill the gunners who fired them. Some fuses survived the launch, but their batteries didn't activate, leaving perfectly good shells to sail harmlessly past their targets. Still others detected their own muzzle blast and triggered instantly. The failure rate during initial testing was catastrophic. For every one fuse that worked as intended, dozens more failed. Tuve's team kept a grim ledger. They tested the fuse against a water-based target in January 1942 and got a 52% success rate. The Navy took that number, not because it was impressive, but because 52% was infinitely superior to the 1 in 1,000 chance they had with conventional rounds. By the time they progressed to simulated combat conditions at Chesapeake Bay, in 1942, firing at radio-controlled drone airplanes, the fuse had been refined through thousands of design changes. Observers watched as shell after shell exploded within lethal distance of the target drone without scoring a single direct hit. The drones simply fell from the sky in pieces. One admiral turned to his aide and said nothing for a very long time. Then he just asked how soon they could get it to the fleet. Production was yet another impossibility made real. Over 100 American companies were brought into the effort. Crosley, a radio maker more famous for its kitchen appliances, joined Raytheon. RCA, Sylvania, Zenith, Eastman Kodak, and even Wurlitzer, the company that built pipe organs. The assembly demanded incredible precision. Each fuse was effectively a tiny, hand-built radio, and the workforce was predominantly female. Women who had been wiring household radios just months prior were now assembling the most classified weapon in the entire American arsenal. By war's end, they had produced 22 million proximity fuses, and they were never once told what they were actually building. The first time a proximity fuse was used in combat was January 5, 1943. A task force near Guadalcanal was attacked by 4 Japanese dive bombers. The cruiser, USS Helena's 5-inch gun crews loaded the new ammunition, which was marked with a simple code, VT, for variable time. That name was a deliberate deception. There was nothing variable about its timing. The name was chosen specifically to mislead anyone who saw it into thinking it was just a new type of timed fuse. Nothing to see here. Move along. The Helena fired 2 salvos, a total of 5 rounds. One of the Japanese bombers disintegrated in mid-air without a single shell, making contact. The blast of shrapnel from a near miss had torn it to shreds. The gun crew just stared. They had never witnessed anti-aircraft firework like that. Within months, every major warship in the Pacific was carrying VT-fused rounds, but not every gunner was a believer. Some crews outright refused to load the new shells. They had spent years training with old ammunition and simply did not believe a shell could think. It took weeks of live demonstrations and, in some cases, direct orders before the new fuse was accepted everywhere. But once it was, the results were undeniable. Before the proximity fuse, it took around 1,000 shells to down one aircraft. With VT fuses, that number plummeted to fewer than 250. By late 1943, shells armed with proximity fuses were responsible for over half of all Japanese aircraft downed by naval guns, despite representing only a quarter of the total ammunition fired. In June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, an event American pilots nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese naval aviation mounted its final large-scale carrier assault. Across 2 days, the Japanese lost over 350 aircraft and 3 aircraft carriers. The proximity fuse wasn't the sole cause of these losses, but it was credited with a huge share of them. American ships withstood wave after wave of attacks that, would have been lethal just 1 year earlier. The Japanese Naval Air Force never recovered. One historian later calculated that Section T's fuse was responsible for approximately 278 aircraft kills in the Pacific. Under the same conditions, conventional, timed fuses would have only accounted for 46. Now, imagine yourself on a ship. The month is April 1945, and you are a 5-inch gun loader on a destroyer performing radar picket duty off Okinawa. The Kamikazes are coming in low, just above the waves, and high, diving out of the sun from 10,000 feet. Your ship has been at general quarters for 6 hours straight. The gun crew is bone-tired. Then, a lookout screams, "Bearing 90, low on the horizon, incoming!" You can see them, 3 Japanese aircraft flying straight for you. Black specks become shapes, growing larger, fast. The gun captain shouts the command, and your crew opens fire. These are VT-fused rounds. The first shell leaves the barrel, and you feel the deck shudder. 6 seconds later, the shell passes within 60 feet of the lead plane and detonates. A sphere of fire and metal fragments tears through the air. The wing shears off. The aircraft cartwheels into the sea 400 yards from your ship. The second plane is already on its way. Another salvo, another near-miss explosion. Shrapnel rips through the engine cowling, and the plane starts trailing black smoke, its nose dipping, striking the water in a plume of white. The third aircraft pulls up, trying to climb and dive from above. The gun crew tracks it. 3 more rounds. One detonates close enough to sever the tail section. The plane tumbles end over end and splashes into the water astern. 3 aircraft down in under a minute. You stopped a massacre without a single direct hit. Before the proximity fuse, at least one of those 3 kamikazes would have hit your ship, and everyone knew it. The fuse wasn't just decisive in the Pacific. When Germany unleashed its V-1 flying bombs on London in summer 1944, conventional anti-aircraft guns and fighter planes struggled to counter them. The V-1 flew low and fast, a small, pilotless drone packed with nearly a ton of high explosives. Hitting it with a timed shell was almost impossible. In June 1944, anti-aircraft units using conventional fuses were shooting down only about 17% of V-1s that flew into their sector. Thousands of civilians were perishing. The British then deployed batteries of 3.7-inch guns armed with VT fuses along the southern coast, moving them to provide clear firing lanes over the English Channel. The improvement was immediate and staggering. Kill rates jumped from 17% to 74% by the end of August. In the final week of the V-1 campaign, AA batteries using proximity fuses destroyed 79% of all V-1s entering their zone. On the very last day, only 4 out of 104 V-1s made it to London. Just 4. A small footnote: the British found the fuse was so sensitive it would sometimes detonate if a shell passed too close to a seabird. A number of unfortunate gulls became the war's most unlikely casualties, but maybe the most devastating application occurred on land. For 2 years, the Pentagon had forbidden the use of the proximity fuse anywhere but over open water. The reason was simple. A dud shell falling on solid ground could be recovered by the enemy and reverse-engineered. Duds over water sank. Duds over land just sat there, waiting to be discovered. But in December 1944, Germany launched its final, desperate offensive through the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. The situation was dire. American forces were being driven back. German infantry were moving in the open across frozen fields. General Eisenhower made the decision: release the fuse. Within hours, American artillery units were loading VT-fused shells into their howitzers for the first time over land. These shells were calibrated to detonate 30 to 50 feet above the ground, creating deadly air bursts that rained shrapnel down on exposed troops. No foxhole was deep enough. No trench was safe. The result was instantaneous and horrific. On Christmas night, 1944, General Patton's Third Army caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River. They pounded them with a concentrated barrage of proximity-fused artillery. An actual count revealed 702 German soldiers were killed in that one engagement. Patton later wrote to the War Department, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad you all thought of it first." A captured German soldier described the attacks more starkly. "Quick, powerful bursts," he reported. "There was simply no defense." Germany never managed to create a working proximity fuse for its artillery. They had experimented with acoustic fuses for rockets and had recovered a few Allied VT duds. But their electronics industry was too overextended and disorganized to reverse engineer the tech in time. The German approach to miniaturization was light years behind the American effort. Where Tuve's team had the full might of the consumer electronics industry, companies that had spent decades making smaller, cheaper, more robust radios for the civilian market, Germany's electronics sector was fractured, starved for resources, and focused almost entirely on radar and communications. They just lacked the industrial capacity to mass-produce miniature components to the required specifications. Japan had nothing even close. The Japanese had never made a serious investment in proximity fuse research, and their electronics industry was even more primitive than Germany's. The closest any Axis power got was a crude magnetic influence fuse for naval mines, which worked on totally different principles and couldn't be adapted for artillery. The Allies possessed a weapon the enemy could not build, could not counter, and for the most part, could not even comprehend. When German ordnance experts examined captured VT fuses, several supposedly refused to believe the components could actually work after being fired from a gun. They concluded it had to be some kind of elaborate trick. The notion that the Americans had constructed a working radio station inside a spinning shell and then produced 22 million of them was simply beyond what they considered possible. After the war, the proximity fuse didn't vanish. It evolved. The miniaturization techniques Tuve's team had pioneered, cramming 130 electronic parts into a space the size of a fist and making them survive forces that could crush steel, became the groundwork for the next generation of military. Electronics, guided missiles, smart bombs, radar-guided anti-aircraft systems. The Sidewinder air-to-air missile, which became the most successful aerial weapon of the Cold War, used a direct descendant of the proximity fuse's detection system. Every precision-guided munition used by any military in the world today can trace its ancestry back to Section T's lab in Silver Spring, Maryland. But the fuse's legacy goes far beyond weaponry. The challenge of making electronics smaller, more rugged, and more reliable pushed American industry into a manufacturing revolution that might have taken decades without the immense pressure of war. The engineers who learned to build radios inside bullets were the ones who went on to build the first transistor circuits. The assembly lines that put together proximity fuses were retooled after the war to make the earliest commercial electronics. Some historians even argue that the proximity fuse project did more to advance the miniaturization of electronics than any other program in history, including the early computer projects. Without Section T, the transistor revolution of the 1950s could have arrived years later. The Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins, which Tuve established to house his team, remains one of America's most vital military research centers 80 years later, still working on the same core problem, making weapons smarter. And the basic principle of the proximity fuse, send out a signal, listen for the echo, act on what you hear, is now embedded in everything from the automatic doors at a grocery store to the parking sensors and collision avoidance systems in your car. The radio that Merle Tuve built inside a bullet is now built into your daily life. Tuve himself simply walked away. When the war was over, he was offered leadership positions for weapons development programs at some of the most powerful institutions in America. He declined every single one. He had witnessed what his creation could do. 700 bodies beside a frozen river, planes ripped apart in the sky, cities saved, and cities burned, and he decided he had seen enough. He went back to the Carnegie Institution and became the director of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, the same quiet office where he had begun. He spent the next 2 decades studying the structure of galaxies with radio astronomy. He aimed his radio receivers at the cosmos instead of at enemy targets. He contributed to experimental seismology, mapped the Earth's crust, and mentored a new generation of physicists who had no clue their professor once built the most secret weapon in the American arsenal. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave interviews about the Fuze. He served on scientific committees and quietly advised the government when asked, but otherwise lived the life of a Washington academic. He died on May 20th, 1982 at age 80, largely anonymous outside the world of physics. The New York Times obituary mentioned the proximity fuse. Most others didn't. And here is the part that is truly incredible. 2 boys, born weeks apart, growing up across the street from each other in Canton, South Dakota, a town of 2,000 souls surrounded by cornfields. They built radios together in an attic when they were just 13. One of them, Ernest Lawrence, would go on to split the atom and help build the weapon that ended the war. The other, Merle Tuve, built a radio small enough to fit inside a shell and smart enough to kill an aircraft it never touched. Both of them reshaped the world using electromagnetic waves. Both started in that same attic. Lawrence got the Nobel Prize. Tuve got a classified file and a letter of thanks. 2 boys, 1 attic. One built the bomb. The other built the bullet, and neither ever forgot where they came from. If you found this story of hidden history fascinating, please hit the like button for the YouTube algorithm and let us know what you think in the comments. We love reading them here at the WWII Record Hub.